the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemy, the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. We would like to mention we have a Patreon account at www.patreon.com/MUHH. New patrons will be given access to our Discord server, which Taylor has very graciously taken the lead in, I guess, what is it? Resuscitating, let's say.
Yeah,
So,
we have some members, just friends of the show, that were already in the Discord, but we want to purpose it specifically for patrons.
Yeah.
And I am planning in the next coming weeks to start a reading group. We'll do a couple of different books. Mainly right now, the candidates are translations that I've done, specifically the forthcoming Chernyavsky translation, the book Deleuze's Philosophy and the Creation of Concepts, and then the forthcoming translation with Rocco Gangle, who's been on the show twice now, right?
Yeah. I was actually thinking we should have Rocco back sometime soon.
Yeah.
The other day. I don't think I've vocalized that, though.
We still do his book on... is it called Diagrammatic Immanence or something like that?
No, but that sounds fucking fascinating.
I can't remember the exact title. He's a super friendly, super smart
awesome guy. Yeah.
I plan after we do the Chernyavsky to do the forthcoming Larawell non-standard philosophy. I didn't want to start with that book because that's 500 pages. I think that what we'll probably do, Coop, is I will maybe confer with you and figure out a way to run either Audacity or some kind of program, or you could even, like, if you want, run your Adobe work and just record the raw audio from the Discord server so that patrons who can't show up and participate, we can make those recordings available, patron exclusives, because we don't put a lot of stuff behind paywalls, and we encourage people to give freely out of just supporting us. This is one of the steps we can start doing to provide more exclusive content. That's my goal, is not just to have a reading group, which is great, but to have those, as I said, raw audio. You won't have to have more work. We could make that exclusive content for patrons, just to maybe, if you're on the fence thinking about joining, that could be a tangible, so to speak, perk for supporting us. And we thank you.
Absolutely. And I think, we don't want to put the podcast behind a paywall necessarily, but we do want to show some appreciation for the Patreons who appreciate us. Today, we're going to be having a look at Freud's essay, Screen Memories, and probably referencing a little bit of an essay by Eugene Mahone called Screen Memories, A Neglected Freudian Discovery.
Yeah, so this was something that I have had in mind to discuss with you ever since, if not before, our discussion of... Well, I guess that episode was Freud's Mystic Writing Pad, which is only like 6 or 7 pages, and Derrida's. Yeah, he's got that essay was probably 25 pages or so. I can't remember. Was that earlier this year? Was that late last year? Something like that? Within the past year, I feel. And been thinking about doing Screen Memories because I do feel like, before we get into it, this 1899 essay, so it's written the same year he publishes his quote-unquote magnum opus, Interpretation of Dreams. And it's theorized that in this long labor leading up to the public... I know that the publication date of Interpretation of Dreams is 1900, but real Freud heads know it's actually published in 1899, by the way. he's spending years writing this work and getting stuck at places. And you can see in his letters to Fleece where he's kind of talking about his writer's block or his inability to finish. And I think Screen Memories is seen as kind of a reflection on a topic that obviously is sort of covered in thinking about how dreams and the dream work is producing these, or works by way of distortions, displacements, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can see in Screen Memories something already akin to that way of working through dreams, not only in the visual content that seems so prominent in these Screen Memories, but in and specifically the method of displacement that is shared between the two. And I guess the only other thing I'll say before we jump in is, I pulled out for us, for anybody just getting into Freud or Lacan, I do recommend the volume by Laplanche and Pontelise, two of Lacan's most prominent students. They wrote you can call it a dictionary, encyclopedia of Freudian, Lacanian, not all Lacan's, but some of Lacan's terminology. And it's kind of a very helpful reference. It's called The Language of Psychoanalysis. And so I pulled some entries for us, or at least the broad definition. So things like infantile sexuality, latency period, memory trace, which we've already obviously discussed in the Mystic Writing Pad episode. What was it? Compromise formation, which I think is important. And there may have been one or two others that I don't even remember that I put down for us. Oh, obviously the entry on Screen Memories. I feel like that already foreshadows some of the big concepts that we will be discussing. But in any case, I always like to get your feedback, because I know we sort of plan this on short notice. Luckily, it's only 20 pages. It's in volume 3 of the standard edition. For those who have access to that, you could probably find Screen Memories somewhere just by Googling it. So listeners who may want a shorter Freud piece that remains relevant, I think, throughout the whole of Freud's work and is relatively early Freud, will be able to read this in a very, potentially in one sitting, right? So, but yeah, I always like to start with some of your takeaways or just what you felt reading it. If you enjoyed it, we can start generally and then move to some of the particulars.
I definitely enjoyed it. You had mentioned to me it was very reminiscent of Mystic Writing Pad. For me, the most interesting theoretical component is this kind of weird recursivity, or the temporality, the aspect of the way that these shreds or these shards of memory or experience from our childhood remain in this sort of late, to use the Mystic Writing Pad example, the top layer of consciousness is perhaps not aware, but there is a trace in this like waxy substrate of the unconscious of this experience or memory or what have you, whatever. So just to emphasize that there's a portion of this, I don't know if it's necessarily always a traumatic experience, but there is this incomplete experience that later on there's a combination with this future or present moment that generates a new memory that is like this retroactive, like the memory occurs, the memory is sort of crystallized from
it's transcribed, as he likes to say, right? There's a transcription of a memory trace that really only becomes activated later.
Yeah, totally. That you took the words out of my mouth there. So I think that process or that aspect, just theoretically going to some of the things that Nick Land talks about with regard to templexity, teleoplexity, and these kind of weird
time is a flat circle,
time coming, like capitalism generating itself from the future. Like, I think you can kind of see the through line from Freud. There's some similarities with Bergsonian,
of course,
conceptions of the way that the syntheses of time through Deleuze and whatnot. So I think to me that's the most theoretically like juicy aspect of it. I'm a little bit less interested in the like specific psychoanalytic content or like
that's what I'm here for, right?
So,
yeah. You're more for the theory of time.
Yeah.
So yeah, with our powers combined, I will say, and you said it earlier to me in a text. Obviously, he isn't really yet thinking out the consequences of this. He's just, one of the terms we could have added in would be sometimes in English, the concept doesn't come out in Strachey's translation so starkly, but it's the notion of Nachträglichkeit, which we have discussed,
right?
Which is in French translated as après coup, which is like an aftershock, if you want to translate it that way. I think Strachey usually translates it as a kind of after the fact, which again, unless you're like looking for it, it does not come out so starkly in English. I don't know if there's one word that Strachey uses to translate the noun. I could be wrong and I'd have to do some research. But in any case, yes, we can see in Screen Memories this, as you said, this sort of retroactive activation of memory traces. This is a part of, if you want to say Freud already had the idea of Nachträglichkeit in 1895 when he co-wrote Studies on Hysteria with Breuer, Freud says hysterics mainly suffer from reminiscences. And what he means by that is that, yes, you could say there's a kernel of a childhood, generally sexual trauma event that, while it did leave a memory trace, did not coalesce. It has to be reactivated in the present, right? It's the present that activates the memory trace. And I think that that's part of what the Screen Memories are showing, is a kind of, and we'll get into this, I guess, but I think that the fact that it takes two events to coalesce into, at least two, right? Obviously, to coalesce into a kind of symptom formation and a negotiation of forces. Because, in 1895, Freud is just in that year dropping the seduction theory. And I think that what's interesting about the seduction theory is Freud is intensely searching for, behind, if you will, the memories for the real event that occurred. And we see in Screen Memories in 1899 a kind of rumination on the fact that a lot of the memories that are being told by his patients, they're not fabrications necessarily out of thin air, but they involve these distortions and displacements. It's not about faulty memory. It's about how there is a kind of, obviously there's a mechanism of repression going on, but in the repression, he uses the physical idea of a parallelogram of forces. If you remember him saying that, have you heard of this term of a parallelogram of forces?
No, but it's a good visual metaphor.
If you've got like two forces,
right? Yeah,
that are
the fore and aft pressure, almost like we've talked about with some other Freudian.
Well, it's like there is Newton even like uses geometry to show this. There's like two forces. You can imagine just like squeezing something and how it dilates and extends, right? There's a kind of way of seeing forces coming together and displacing the linear trajectory of a phenomenon. Good. And so Freud is thinking about how these two memories, because you have to have at least two for the Screen Memories, right? One is serving as a screen, whether from before or after. So you've got these, if you've got A and A prime, one in the past and in the future, whatever, they are sort of condensing and displacing and squeezing the memory in such a way that it distorts and displaces elements, sometimes condensing elements, sometimes confusing them in a way. But again, it's not about fabricated from thin air. There is a kind of anchor, but it gets stretched. It's like plastic, I think, is what he's thinking of. And the forces obviously are libidinal cathexes and intensities, intense lived experiences, and the mechanism by which consciousness is sort of warded off from a too highly charged event. Anyway, all of this is sort of speaking about these things broadly, but I did like Freud's kind of simile of this parallelogram of forces where you can start with a square, and if you can think about putting pressure on, diagonally on each point, it literally squeezes into a kind of parallelogram, right? You can kind of like imagine that. I'm rotating the cube in my mind right now, right? You can kind of see that going on, and that's how he's kind of thinking about screen memories. But we haven't really even, I guess we've only sort of, we're sort of taking these detours and
while I'm thinking about it, I'll just to detours again further real quick. Did you feel like this is like an example of kind of a synthesis of the unconscious of a type? The screen memory, it's like an exclusive conjunction, or the traumatic element is excluded from memory, but it's like the syntheses of the past and the present, or the past and the present synthesize into this moment of the new, or the whatever the screen memory. You might have to help me with a little bit.
Well, it wouldn't be. I mean, there is something disjoined. You're right. So
time is out of joint.
so if you think about it, what Freud is trying to say is that there's competing forces. Because I was using the parallelogram. The competing forces are the way in which Freud consistently thinks that that memory traces are sort of preserved intact, if you will, right? And for Freud, if you recall, the traces in perception and consciousness are instantaneous, but something is preserved in the unconscious. And there's that layer in between. The preconscious is what we can sort of, if you think about what we can actively recall by reflecting through our memory, that's the little protective sheath in the middle that we can sort of. Anyway,
we'll see. I just real quick, because I was going to say that preserving aspect, it's like the dialectical sort of vibe of this.
Yeah, if you want to talk about Freud's dialectic, the dialectic would be between. There's a compromise between the mechanism by which memory is sort of stored, that the traces are stored in the unconscious, and the translation of those traces into active, either conscious reflections, right? They're brought to consciousness, but in that transition from one registration system to another through the preconscious, if you will, there is that translation involves a kind of undergoes the mechanism of repression, if you will, right? So what that means is the dialectic is between, the compromise is the word he uses, is between storing memories, if you want to use that terminology, storing the memory traces, and the means by which consciousness is protected from an overly cathected, intense experience.
Yeah, okay.
Right? Because Freud says, why is it that one would think that events that occur in our life that we experience that are most intense are most easily remembered. So why is infantile amnesia a thing? He's working with empirical psychology of the time, and he even cites the authors, again, brothers or husband, wife, the Henris that publish this sort of questionnaire correspondence with 123 members, and they're asking questions about memory and recall from childhood and things like this. Because the whole problem Freud starts with is, why is it that we really only start to have a quote unquote continuous sequence of memory at age, could be 4, could be 6, could be 10. It really depends on the individual we're talking about. So why is infantile amnesia a thing? And for Freud, the answer is not merely that the child's brain is still developing and all that. Sure, that probably plays a part in it, but we also know children from the age and when they can start talking at even like 1.5 or earlier to 2 to 3, they are, truth from the mouth of babes and shit like that. Like their mental faculties are sharp enough to even have memories at the time in which they, start talking, at least recall. It's not just brain development for Freud. Something else is going on. Something more, if you will, metapsychological, metaphysical is at play. And for him, it's infantile amnesia. And he doesn't describe it. He doesn't go into length at this here. But if you think about, it'll be 6 years later in 3 essays on sexuality, which we've also discussed, where Freud begins. The first essay is on childhood sexuality, is on the polymorphously perverse nature of the infant, its multiplicity of erotogenic zones. And I think for Freud, the answer is now the term he often uses is infantile masturbation, but I think that's a stand-in for this polymorphously highly cathected erotogenic multiplicity of the body without organs of the infant, or whatever the fuck you want to call it, right? If you want to use Deleuze-Guattarian terms. But the point being, for Freud, there's a latency period that begins, and it has to do for him with the Oedipus complex and sort of resigning our struggle with the father over the love of the mother and all that shit, right? We start to enter what he calls a latency period at the age of 6, where our polymorphously perverse multiplicity begins to, and he'll later talk about these different stages, right? Oral, anal, phallic, genital. We don't have to necessarily go into that, but you can start to see that there's a way in which, at least if you think about the anal stage, right, where we start to get potty trained and we start to become responsible for, we start to privatize our organs, if you will. We start to become responsible for our
shit.
Our managing our shit and our waste.
Yeah, keeping our shit together.
We start to become a well-disciplined, organized body. I think that for him is when we start to enter this latency period where what is primally repressed is that state of infantile sexuality. And so for him, infantile amnesia relies upon, or has to be explained by, the latency period up to puberty, where we sort of again become a kind of sexuated body, but in a new way, in a way not completely different from how we were in infantile sexuality, because there's always going to be these hangovers and hangups and fixations, and that's the whole point of psychoanalysis, to try to like work through that shit. But obviously now we become adult, we become able of procreating, we get this on surge and apparatus of hormonal influx, blah, blah, blah. I guess the main point being is, so there is, the compromise then goes through all of this. And insofar as we have infantile amnesia for Freud, there are the memories that have left these traces from earliest childhood, many of which involve a sexual nature. And as we know from Laplanche, that doesn't have to be necessarily seduced, molested, and whatnot, is that we are still, even before we are able to process sexual signifiers, we are bombarded by the adult world of sexuality without being able to process it. And I think that for Freud, the compromise then would be, these intense memory traces. One side of the psychical apparatus is applying the force of recording, quote unquote, faithfully the events, the transcriptions. And the other side, which is bringing those memory traces to consciousness, insofar as there's going to be a translation between those transcription systems, those registration systems, as he calls it. The other force is working under the repression, not only of infantile sexuality, but of later adult sexuality, and is warding off from consciousness, from the ego, if we want to bring in that language, that which is most libidinally cathected, right? I think this all has to do with, there's a type of shielding, right? There's a type of warding off and of diffusing too, of those unbound libidinal charges. In the binding that consciousness brings with it, there is inevitably a distortion. So that's the kind of thesis, synthesis, antithesis, if you want to term it in crude, vulgar Hegelian terms, even though obviously that's, so I guess that's the thing, right? Again, Freud is not a Hegelian in any traditional sense, but you can see a kind of, if you want to use the term, sublation. Each side wins out, though, right? So there is for Freud.
See, that's why I was thinking this disjunctive synthesis of past and present or future or whatever. But
what is excluded, as you said, is the more or most traumatic aspects.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. I didn't know if that was like really doing anything of use, but it's not just an either or, right? Because the part of the psychical apparatus that is recording wins out because something specific is recorded, and I think that for Freud, that's the screen. What seems like a fully lived, intense memory, the screen, to the point of hallucination, that is the element of memory doing its job. It wins out. Now, repression wins out on its side because the scene or the screen, the memory that is recalled, seems to be indifferent in terms of its content, quote unquote. In terms of what it can tell us about our symptom, if it is indeed related to a symptom, and for Freud, that's the value of these screen memories to a certain extent, it doesn't really have the content that we might expect. One of the examples Freud gives is of the woman who, I think it was a hysteric. It's an aside in later in the screen memories. She's recalling and like sort of quoting by memory this novel, I assume, that she had read. And Freud's like, why is it that she's in her hysteric attacks and she's getting frantic? She's quoting the most banal passages that have nothing to do. And he's like, look, if you look the surrounding material, this is where the libidinally charged area is that is associated with her symptom. So there's a compromise. She is actively quoting around the edges or in between the fucking charged parts, but she's also being able to repress those charged parts, right? So there's a kind of, I think for Freud, that's what a screen memory does similarly, that it's so intense and yet it seems so banal and innocent. And it's innocent because of repression, but it's intense because of the memory. The memory is trying to preserve some scene that was intensely lived, but it's covering over, it's veiling, it's screening out those elements that might bear some truth about the subject's desire.
I was going to say symptom or problem, but yes, exactly, because it is related to at least the functioning of desire.
I mean, my dream that I told you about would be a good fit, but I want to take a little bit of a detour, and I hope that you'll forgive me for this, but I want to describe it as more like one of Deleuze's syntheses of time regarding this relationship between the memories and the way that this works in Freud's essay. So to go back to Anti-Oedipus and the way that the state forms, also Moses and monotheism would be a good springboard for that too, in the way that there's two Moseses, right? And Moses's monotheism, that
there's a latency period between the
precisely.
two. Yeah.
Precisely. And so it's this like repressed element of the past, the repressed past Moses and the second Moses synthesized.
And like screens out some of the more intense, wild elements, but while letting some
like us, through. Like them killing Moses, for example, maybe like the first Moses, right, out of anger or being in the position of the primal father or something like that, where we angrily take out Moses and then we repress our memories of killing him. And so this kind of mass psychology thing with respect to, Deleuze's concept of chronos and aeon and how those different forms of time sort of work. I think there's maybe some type of relevance. And may even read this passage from Mahone, unless you have something to interject on just on those points regarding, Moses and monotheism. And even the way that, okay, I guess I should say this too. The way that they describe the state forming like lightning is almost similar. It's like this.
That's Nietzsche, by the way. But yeah, go ahead.
The way that whatever latent content in the unconscious, the machinic unconscious, or the unconscious as this whatever, I don't know, this repressed content within the unconscious and the mass the molar unconscious. It's like these shards, these elements then crystallize, like they're kind of sitting there latent until there's a crystallization, and then boom, it's like that thing has been, like I think Deleuze and Guattari say, then it's like as if it's always been in place, right?
The Urstadt, it's always been there.
Precisely.
Which is very similar to the primal repressed, which forms the unconscious, right? So it's as though it's always been there, even as though it's been there before the unconscious, which for me is like, it's this interesting paradox that you see in certain astronomical calculations of the oldest stars being older than the supposed birth of the universe, right?
Yeah.
These interesting things where it's like,
to me, that's why this is the most theoretically interesting component of the whole discussion.
The temporal aspect.
The temporal, because of this like weird retroactive narrative creation process that like defies this linear aspect of time. I'm probably got these reversed, but for Deleuze, Chronos, is that the linear aspect of time, or is that
Chronos is the time of bodies? Chronos would
is
the time of the full present.
Gotcha.
Where past and future are merely aspects of this full present.
Okay.
Right. Chronos is the time of bodies, whereas Ion is the time of events.
Okay, gotcha.
Right. So obviously there are some Stoic scholars that kind of, Deleuze kind of got it wrong, kind of got it right. But for Deleuze, yes, from the Stoic conception of time, Chronos is the time of bodies. Bodies are the only things that exist, properly speaking, whereas events subsist or insist in bodies. And Ion would be the infinitesimal present and the indefinite subdivision into past and future. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And
so there's two ways. It's not two exclusive ways of looking at time, by the way. It's two ways of looking at time that are asymmetrical, but not exclusive. Because you can't bodies don't exclude events except in their mixtures. They are mixed together, but events obviously occur. And so it's really kind of like, for example, smooth space and striated space, which I know one day we're going to read 1,000 Planets. Those are like limit cases that are always mixed. And not to say that,
gotcha.
If you looked at merely bodies, if that were possible, that would be Chronos, the full present, where the past and the future are almost epiphenomenal or merely an effect of the present, right? Whereas Ion, the present is this infinitesimal instant that is subdivided infinitely, indefinitely into past and future. Because this is why Deleuze will say, like, the event is just about to happen or just happened, but is not happening now, because that's the time of bodies, right? That's Chronos. The synthesis of time is actually from difference of repetition and is slightly different. We'd have to read chapter 2 of difference of repetition. Again, I know we would get there, but it has to do with formation of memory, habit, things like this. And I think that, yes, there is something about screen memories that brings into play the interaction of Chronos and Ion. I can see why you thought about that.
I mean, I had mentioned earlier in the week, maybe even a few days ago, just how like this was making me think of this shard of whatever memory as like this it's like this virtual, in the Deleuzian sense, it's held in this kind of virtual space until something in the present then actualizes it in the like
Yeah.
I'm probably fucking up the terminology.
No.
I don't know how to describe that per se.
No, that's it. I mean, like, I think you're right that there is an actualization, and if you will, more appropriately, there is in the compromise formation, there is an individuation going on, because what is translated and negotiated and what is allowed to be actualized from this virtual of the primal repressed, if you will, if you want to use those terms, is intensity. And we know that
yeah, that's good.
that intensity is what the psychical apparatus is trying to manage. Obviously, Freud uses the term libido or cathexis.
Right, yeah.
But intensity is what is trying to be managed. And that's why the Nachträglichkeit of the current experience, filtering, screening through the past in this negotiation, there is an individuation going on.
Okay, cool.
And what is negotiated is the charge of affect, if you will.
Gotcha.
The quota of affect, the intensity involved.
Okay.
Otherwise, there wouldn't be a screen. Otherwise, the screen memory wouldn't be so fresh to the point of hyper-lucid and clear to the point of hallucination. That's the residues of the intensity and the success of the memory formation. But the fact that the screen memory, insofar as it's intense, isn't about some sexual occurrence, but it has to be, I don't want to say sublimated because that's misusing terminology, but it has to be sort of, it literally has to be filtered out. It has to be kind of drained of
the sexual
I guess there's a difference between I think, okay, so there is the compromise is not just between the repressive apparatus and the memory storing apparatus, if you will. The other compromise is between the ideational representative, if you want to use Freud's term. The idea that is meant to be stored is what is repressed.
And now, then we're left with the
Freud,
image,
the
right?
screen but for Freud, the screen is associated temporally or contiguously, right? Like the woman repressing those sexual passages, but quoting verbatim the passages surrounding it. The idea is what is repressed. The affect associated, though, is still, that libidinal charge is still there. That's how the symptoms stay locked in. That's how you have the clarity, the hyper-lucid aspect of the memory itself. But the idea associated with it is severed or excluded, to use your term, right? That's what's being excluded. And I think that the affect is kind of like the smoke, and the idea is the fire. It's evidence, it's an index that there is some sort of associative links that need to be reconstructed. It's interesting that the distortion takes place not just in the recall of the memory, but then in the working through of analysis with the analyst and with the analysand, because not all of working through is obviously done by the analyst. A lot of it's done by the analysand. There is also other distortions, if you want to call it that, where, quote unquote, we are constructing. Now we are also reconstructing links that have been severed off by the psychical apparatus in its attempt to ward off the ideational representative of the traumatic kernel of the repressed, right, etc. I apologize.
No, that was all good. That was great. I'm glad you did, because I think that led into, we could go to Freud's own example from self-analysis of the dandelion, right? The image of the yellow dandelion, and how this plays into this notion of deflowering. You would probably remember the whole narrative better than I would, but I just wanted to throw you that ball.
We'll go back into the essay, because I've been kind of giving some of the architecture surrounding it, and this is from, not all reproduced in this essay. Even if though one comes to this essay with little or no Freud, I still think it's worth a lot of value, but it helps to put in context some of the surrounding stuff, which is what we've been doing. So getting back to the essay, you're right. So Freud starts with the problem of infantile amnesia, as I said, and we walk through some of that. There is a primary repressed. Again, that's not in the essay, but that's assumed, sort of. And his problem is, I don't think the solution is that children's brains are still forming. That's a contingent empirical fact, but that's not explanatory of the absoluteness or the sort of ubiquity of,
not on its own, at least,
of infantile amnesia as a kind of a fact. For Freud, he wants to interpret it. He wants to interpret the psychogenesis differently than just neurologically. Does that make sense? He is thinking about psychogenesis, but he's not going to approve of merely a kind of biological facts that brains are still forming. Because for him, the psychical apparatus itself is also still formation, and sexuality itself is flourishing at an infantile state, but it goes into dormancy, latency, and then it resurges with puberty, right? So that for him is kind of essential to part of this. Now, he's going to say that he has a 38-year-old patient who he helped with a minor phobia. We're not necessarily told what that minor phobia is. That could just be his way of himself screening, providing cover for the patient that he is describing, because his patient is who he says is evidence of. He says he's going to turn to a patient who is not neurotic or only very slightly neurotic for his evidence. And for him, his patient kind of had these insights spontaneously when being told by Freud himself what screen memories were and how they functioned. And he reproduces some dialogue. He puts the patient's, like he did in the Ratman case, if you remember, he puts the patient's verbiage in inverted commas, right, in single apostrophes, and he responds without them. And we learn from the editors, and we know this from biographers, that Freud's patient is himself. Because around this time in the 1890s, he has embarked on the journey of self-analysis. And as we learn from Lacan and from Freud himself later, if you are to become an analyst, you have to be analyzed. Well, how does the first psychoanalyst come into being? Well, you've got to self-analyze, right? Freud had to analyze himself. And we have evidence of this not just from biographers and from other sources, but from his letters to Fleece and others at the time. He's sort of talking a little bit about some of this material. And the David Smith essay I shared with you goes really deep in the weeds in his biography to provide all this evidence about this screen memory that he retells from his patient, who is himself, as I said. The way that it comes about is in this dialogue, if you want to call it that, where, as I told you, it seems that Freud's patient is smarter than Freud himself, or more pedantic, or like more almost schooled in psychoanalysis himself. I mean, Freud kind of doesn't really try to, it's a pretty flimsy screen if you see it. Like, this guy talks and writes kind of like Freud at his most scholarly. Anyway, there's a couple of stages to how screen memories form, but we can start with the childhood memory that is supposedly so intense. If I can recall at least elements of it, the way that Freud has his patient himself tell it, where he's around the age of 6, maybe younger, maybe 4, 5, 6.
I'd have to look at the text. I have no idea off the top of my head.
It is important for this discussion of latency theory, so just give me a second to pull it up.
Yeah, no worries.
Again, I think it's funny. He's setting up the story, and he says, its value is certainly increased by the fact that it relates to someone who is not at all or only very slightly neurotic. So I like that, like, again, kind of like wink, wink, tongue in cheek. I'm only, and which for Freud, being neurotic or slightly neurotic is basically akin to quote unquote normal. So he says, from at the age of 3, I left the small place where I was born and moved to a large town, and all these memories of mine relate to my birthplace and therefore date from my 2nd and 3rd years. They are mostly short scenes. For my 3rd year honors, my recollections grow scantier. Until my 6th or 7th year, that the stream of my memories becomes continuous. He tells about his injury to his face and all the blood he should remember from age 2. So his patient is providing evidence of infantile amnesia. Why is it that this emergency that I had at age 2. I don't remember that, but I remember this little scene that I'm about to tell. By the way, that was another clue to biographers that this is Freud. Freud's patient uses the word material when he's talking about the screen memory. Material is psychoanalytic speak for that which the patient produces. So he's talking like a psychoanalyst, right? The scene appears to me fairly indifferent, and I cannot understand why it should have become fixed in my memory, which we've already described. He doesn't give his age here, and biographers might be able to tell it, but he does. The patient, Freud himself, doesn't give his age. Can I just read this then? I see a rectangular, rather steeply sloping piece of meadowland, green and thickly grown. In the green, there are a great number of yellow flowers, evidently common dandelions. At the top end of the meadow, there is a cottage, and in front of the cottage door, 2 women are standing chatting busily. A peasant woman with a handkerchief on her head and a children's nurse. 3 children are playing in the grass. So already notice in the screen memory, by the way, and this is my side, obviously, it's interesting that Freud is not telling a first-person perspective. This is how we already know it's a screen, because he's not saying I see 2 other children. He's describing it like a narrator would from a third-person perspective. There are 3 children. He's one of the 3. Freud, as patient, is one of the 3. 3 children are playing in the grass. One of them is myself, between the age of 2 and 3. Okay, so we do get the age. Between the age of 2 and 3. The 2 others are my boy cousin, who is a year older than me, and his sister, who is almost exactly the same age as I am. We are picking the yellow flowers, and each of us is holding a bunch of flowers we have already picked. The little girl has the best bunch, and as though by mutual agreement, we, the 2 boys, fall on her and snatch away her flowers. She runs up the meadow in tears, and as a consolation, the peasant woman gives her a big piece of black bread. Hardly have we seen this than we throw the flowers away, hurry to the cottage, and ask to be given some bread too. And we are in fact given some. The peasant woman cuts the loaf with a long knife. In my memory, the bread tastes quite delicious, and at this point, the scene breaks off. Of course, Freud's patient then it's not like, why is it I remember this scene so vividly, and it doesn't really have anything to do with my supposed phobia that is being treated for. We can begin there. That's the quote unquote screen memory. And I will say, and we may not spend enough time on this, but normally Freud is going to talk, when he talks about screen memories later, he's going to think of an event in the recent past, current adult, that acts as a screening out a childhood event. This is a childhood supposed memory from childhood that will be a what he calls a retrogressive screen. It will screen something out forward, and those are the stages we have to go through, the different returns of the repressed or Nachträglichkeits. But that type of screen falls out of favor and really doesn't. I think it shows up once in the interpretation of dreams, whereas a few of the, if you want to use the term progressive screen memories, shows up a few times, where something from the, if you want to say future or future present, is screening out something from the past rather than vice versa. Anyway, so that's the story, right? He and his cousin steal this girl's flowers, and she goes off to be consoled, gets the bread. They obviously are like, fuck these flowers, we really want. The 2 images that Freud says later, or Freud's patient says later, that are most intense is the yellow of the dandelions and the deliciousness of the bread. And those become the kind of focal points, if you will, for Freud, this time not the patient, but you can suppose Freud reflexively self-analyzing, because he has to split himself in self-analysis, if you will. And this is why we have this way of writing it, that he will put the most interpretive force on these 2 focal points of the yellow dandelions as flowers, because that, as you already kind of anticipated, becomes important, and the bread. And there I can pause and let you say what you remember from reading this.
I mean, I was just thinking that was a good example of this quote unquote unimportant detail of the yellow.
Yeah.
Is this, the image stands as the screen for this desire to deflower from this later instance in Freud's adolescence, whatever, right?
Yeah, so I think that what Freud comes to in interpreting the flowers and stealing the girl's flowers, and that being a common term for taking your girl's virginity as deflowering, I think what Freud comes to at the end of the essay is not that he as a child necessarily had this intention, but that the focus on the flowers represents, again, retrogressively, stands in for a contemporary, and as I said, there's a couple of contemporaneities of Nocturglikites, stands in for more contemporary desires later. So there is a kind of projection going on from the future to the past, this temporal thing. But I think that the way that Freud's reading is not as a boy, even given childhood infantile sexuality, if you recall, the way I've been describing infantile sexuality, polymorphous perversity, sure, there could be some experimentations going on, but the conscious idea of raping another girl at the age of 2 or 3 is not quite what Freud is primarily thinking of. Even if those events may occur contingently, he's thinking more of the way in which our own bodies are any sort of excitations can become a kind of source of intense sexual pleasure in the child's body. So it's not, we just have to.
Well, that's where the bread, right? The intense
feeling
pleasure brought upon by the bread is where maybe that's the glue, so to speak, of.
So the first step is the flowers, and so the first, and I'm not necessarily going to quote more from the text, even though we could. Is Freud says, or Freud's patient himself says, okay, so at 17, I go back. I return to the place of my birth, which I think was Freiburg, although he doesn't say, and it doesn't matter. And he stays with either that cousin that was the year older or someone else, and maybe stays with a family friend. And he intensely falls in love with the daughter of the family who's 15. Her name is Gisela. He falls in love with this girl, but is too bashful or doesn't reveal his love, unrequited love, but also kept to himself. So how could you requite it anyway? But anyway, so he falls in love with this girl and kind of broods in the forest, which he recalls kind of lovingly, like, why did we have to move from the place of my birth? And he says it was because of money circumstances. So already he's conscious, at least, if not at the age of 2 and 3, obviously before they moved, but at the age of 17, about the fact that his life would have been different if his family would have stayed at a prominent financial position. I'm only saying this because, as you and I have known, rarely is ever money issues completely divorced from some of the case studies we've done. Ratman is just the most prominent one. But so at 17, he's, thinking about how, man, if my parents would have stayed at this social standing, we never had to move to Vienna for money reasons, then I would have known this girl all my life and already been able to express my love for her or develop a romantic relationship. That's partly what keeps him at bay at 17. One can, if we dig deeper into the way the story unfolds, that's partly one of the reasons why he probably never reveals his love, because it wasn't meant to be. She goes back to her boarding school or whatever the fuck, and he never kind of tells her about it. But he sort of recalls this yellow dress that she would wear, right? And I think later at age 20, his older brother and his father are sort of conspiring to have him marry his cousin who would be the little girl from the memory, right? But Freud, by now at age 20, is already, or age 19, 20, I forget exactly, it doesn't matter, but he's already engrossed in his university studies. He's already sublimated that erotic, compulsion that he had at 16, 17 for the other girl. And his brother and his father give up on trying to get him to marry his cousin. And so I think that what's interesting about that is because one of the things that Freud brings up as analyst for the patient Freud, right, because he's self-reflecting, is Freud is trying to say, well, my father is trying to get me to marry my cousin, and also to sort of not pursue this neurological path that he had just committed to. Wants him to take up a kind of practical life so he can be the breadwinner. If we want to foreshadow what the bread's intensity means, right? If the yellow of the dandelions is represented by this intense desire at a young age, right? You can fall in and out of love very quickly, right? This libidinal cathexis at a certain age, and he's also thinking, again, the wish fulfillment isn't necessarily just, I want this girl. And I think this is where Freud could go deeper. The wish fulfillment is really, I wish my parents would have not had to make us move. I'm nostalgic for my home, but also nostalgic for the privileges that we had. You can think about Back to the Future and how it starts, where Marty McFly's parents are these kind of fuck-ups, right? His mom's a drunk. His dad is a simpering pussy who's beholden to Biff, and he can't go meet his girlfriend for whatever fucking date because Biff has borrowed and wrecked the car. There's something similar going on there, right? That, Freud's got a little bit of resentment at this young age for his parents being fuck-ups. Whether or not they really were is immaterial, right? It's a part of that fantasy. And so I think that Freud even says in this essay that it's clear that my father and my older brother, whatever he has to do with it, I guess he's still trying to include his older brother in this because of the fact that he's in the scene with him. He calls him his uncle in this, by the way, but it's not. It's his older brother. Again, I'm just in case you guys reread this, and he's saying that his father is trying to give him a consolation prize for what he takes to be this traumatic. The traumatic event is having to move, right, from his childhood home because of money circumstances. But the bread and butter, the intensity of the taste of the bread is the taking up a practical job and not going into the career path. Now, the final element is the fact that at 38, supposedly, in his self-analysis, or in the way the story goes, that he's talking to Freud, the patient is talking to Freud, the analyst. Why is it that he still has this intense memory? So we have a couple of stages along the way, but this last one, if you will, of the contemporary present in which this is told and worked through, there is a kind of practical crisis in Freud's life where he is not quite certain that psychoanalysis is going to be able to make him a living and allow him to support his family and himself. He has embarked upon a new science and practice that, I think that to a certain extent, he may have had a solid career doing hypnosis and in the way in which he learned it from Charcot and using suggestion as a means of temporarily, if you will, providing kind of placebo effects to relieve symptoms. But he's already given up on that path, and he's embarked upon this kind of new path that he has to forge and build by himself. He's got the pressure of whether or not he's going to make headway and even finish the interpretation of dreams, and whether or not it'll be received. The editors to this essay say that Freud himself writes in a letter that he was very excited when he finished this essay, which for him is a bad omen that it's going to be poorly received. So he's already got this conflict in his brain about the passion with which he pursues his endeavors is inversely proportionate to the way in which it will be publicly received and whether or not it'll be quote unquote successful, which at the end of the day is earning his daily bread. Now, the paper was well received at the time. So those fears were, but you can see that he's got those fears in a contemporaneous sense because he is struggling in the late 1880s and early 1890s, if not in beginning his publication, because he is publishing. I mean, he published Studies on Hysteria 2 years earlier, or 4 years earlier, and a number of technical papers and other things. But it's not until a little bit later into the 20th century that Freud starts to get a little bit more financially secure. At the turn of the century, when he writes this, Freud is worried about if he's going to be able to make ends meet, if he's going to be able to win the bread. And so I think that that's the way to interpret the intensity of how delicious that bread tastes. I think that's a solid reading. I don't necessarily have a counter reading to offer, but I'm trying to provide a little bit more background for this way of interpreting it. And I'm going a little bit beyond the essay itself, I think, but it's latent there, if you will, right? I mean,
No, I think that was a good excursus to go down.
Less of an excursus and more of a providing details for the,
which I think is good,
for the meat and potatoes, to use another food term, of the essay. The bulk of the essay is this reconstructed self-analysis as dialogue, which is really fascinating to me in a certain way.
Do you think that the dream that I told you about would be maybe something fun and interesting to look at? I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is, maybe it's in the Mahone essay, he talks about how the kind of dream work and the memory work have a certain similarity.
And I alluded to that earlier, right? That screen memories and using some of there is a screen work going on. This is what Mahone says, right?
Right.
He proposes a term for what is going on in the compromise formations. Sorry, compromise formation describes symptoms. I shouldn't use that so loosely. But in the compromise that the screen memory is doing and providing for the current experience in the aftershock, the noctreglicite, etc., there is what he calls a screen work that is similar to what the dream is doing in the dream work, right? The mechanisms by which the dream is modified. One of the reasons for which is to not disturb us in our sleep and to pass by the censor. There is a kind of similar, even if he doesn't call it that, in one of the elements of the compromise being repression, it's also trying to censor things. And that censorship does cause a certain distortion and displacement. But yeah, please feel free to talk about your experience as a case study, if you will.
Right. I think Mahone even mentions Oedipus as well. And I forget the exact context. I'd have to look at that. But let me delve into this dream and perhaps even a bit of preamble to set the scene, so to speak. So obviously, anyone who's listened to the podcast for an extended period of time knows that I'm obsessed with Dune. And so I had a dream this week that I found was, I don't know, just the experience was notable in that I don't recall specifically if this was two separate dreams where, one ended and then another began, or if it was one continuous dream. But there was a kind of element to where I had a memory surface from a prior dream, or in the temporality of the dream, this sort of memory resurfaces later on. So I'll walk you through. I had a dream where I took a shower with the actress Rebecca Ferguson, who played Lady Jessica in the Dune movie. There was nothing sexual about the shower whatsoever, but we were naked and we showered together. I forget the specific context. It might have been some kind of like I was involved in the production and somehow like we wound up taking a shower together as asexual, the way in which you might as a child take a shower with your mother, let's say. Subsequently, either in the same dream or a second dream instance in the same night that evening. I rehearsed this to someone at an event. And again, this is within a dream. I was kind of saying in a kind of joking manner, well, I have taken a shower. I have showered with Rebecca Ferguson as kind of this, I don't know, like a sort of humble brag. But again, no sexual content or like there's no sexuality, desexualized totally. And then when I woke up in the morning, it was really shocking to me how intensely real the memory of taking the shower with Rebecca Ferguson was. So much so that I was like blown away that when I was recounting this story in the dream, it felt like a memory from my real life. Like this had actually occurred in my real life. And then when I woke up, I was kind of like just blown away as far as how real this memory seemed within the context of the dream, but it was totally fabricated. And so.
Well, I would say a few things. One, around this time, he's writing The Fleece he's almost thinking through screen memories. So this is like 1896, 97 when he's writing The Fleece. His idea about repression is not so much that the sexual element in itself is what is repressed. What is repressed is what is sort of taken, again, by consciousness, by the ego, right? To use later Freudian terminology. What the ego is protected from is not sexual content per se, but the perverse element. The perverse element is what the censor, if you will, would be alarmed at. Does that make sense? Now, I'm only preparing my comments because I don't know if we can immediately uncover whatever perverse element that is censored out, because you have.
Well, maybe it's the Oedipal desire for the mother.
Well, okay, so I was going to get there.
Back into sexuality.
You already entered that into evidence when you said like taking a shower with your mother, and I'm like, right. Okay, that's okay. All right, paging Dr. Freud, we've got him right here. I submit to evidence that I already told you, but for the listener, I mean, you have, and you may want to divulge this yourself. You have recounted to me several times your intense experience watching Lynch's Dune. And that's where we have a different actress portraying Lady Jessica. But I feel like you've told me that you've had a sexual proclivity for this actress as well, particularly in that role,
right? Yeah.
Lady Jessica.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who is obviously mother of Paul Muad'Dib. So do you want to say anything about that before I continue my suspicion?
I mean, yeah, just to like make it clear that this was one of my earliest like sexual desires was for her.
Right.
Probably the Oedipality of it, whatever, was like super intense and like
she is a little bit more matronly in Lynch's Doom, right?
I felt like the intensity of desire in a sexual way, probably then, like that was maybe one of the most intense aspects of that feeling that I had, at that point ever, I suppose.
Is that 5, 6? Is it 6 years old?
6, 7, somewhere in there.
6, 7? Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't really have.
So one of your first memories after infantile amnesia. There you go.
Yeah, exactly.
The actress, I'll have to look up her name.
Francesca Annis.
She's portrayed and bedecked a little bit more in a more matronly way in Lynch's Dune, right? I don't think her hair is revealed, right? They all have like the bald cuts, kind of.
Well, no, not Jessica. No? That's the other Bene Gesserits are portrayed that way, but she has actual hair. No.
Okay. I'm misremembering. You're right.
I might have to pull up a photo of her as Jessica. So you can see.
Obviously, Rebecca Ferguson is a good-looking woman, and they don't try to hide that in Villeneuve's portrayal of her. But I guess that's the interesting. Okay, yeah, right.
I guess at the end she does have the Bene Gesserit look.
But maybe at the end she would have become a part of the Fremen.
Yeah, she was the Reverend Mother for the Fremen.
She would become a Reverend Mother.
Exactly.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, okay, so I'm wrong. Yeah, maybe I'm just thinking about the end of the movie where she has the hair shorn. But yeah, she's a good-looking lady as well. Obviously, older woman for a 6-year-old, 7-year-old. But yeah, I guess that's the interesting thing, right? Is that's one of your first intense memories, and so it makes sense of connecting these two, where you may not have had as intense a desire for Rebecca Ferguson in the latest Dune movie, but that recalls and reactivates that first memory trace, right? For Francesca. What's her last name? Francesca
Annis.
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 And then, of course, bringing in the Oedipal desire and the sort of love for an older woman, the desire for the mother, that kind of puts you in the fantasy space, if we want to be very broad with this, in the role of Muad'Dib, right? In the role of Paul, the role of the hero, anti-hero of the story of Dune, which is a kind of feedback loop that insists why you are so enamored with the series, because you found yourself at the age of 6 already at this Oedipal stage of embodying Paul. I'm not even trying to be very Freudian or even like I'm being pretty crude.
No, man,
about this,
run with take it and run with it. I think it's fascinating. I mean,
yeah, but I guess why the memory is so intense can only be explained for me by the sexual excitement you felt when you were a kid watching Lynch's Dune. Again, that's a crude interpretation, but that's the only way I can elaborate on the intensity of that dream, so intense that you recalled it as a real memory in a contemporaneous
in the dream space, yeah,
or successive dream, yeah.
Which was that? I mean, to me, that was it was so intensely real, shocking. When I woke up that next morning, I was like, "Whoa, that's fucking crazy." You know what I mean?
Yeah, and so I guess the perverse, quote unquote, perverse sexual element is, and this is why I told you retrogressive childhood screen memories like the one that Freud works through are very rare. In Freud's literature itself, in the psychoanalytic literature, it's much clearer that the screen memory is the one that you're talking about in the present, but it relates back to childhood material rather than the other way around. And I think that, if you want to call it a perverse element, I don't know, if you want to, your sexual arousal itself could be a stand-in for childhood masturbation. Not saying you did masturbate, but it's at least associatively, ideationally linked to a type of sexual act for which 6-year-olds should not obviously be in that situation. So that's the repressed element is that intense cathexis, sexual,
or the desire, maybe the desire to
be with the mother.
Well, that too, but I was even thinking just in the sense of like having the sexual energy, but not having a means by which to
discharge, to do anything with it.
I wasn't masturbating until much.
No,
later.
I know. I figured that. I figured as much.
I mean, I know that I believe some children do masturbate before puberty,
Freud,
but to me, I never did. That I recall.
This is why I said earlier that when Freud says infantile masturbation, I take that broadly.
I've had people tell me that they masturbated at like 10 and what have you, but I was like closer to 13 before I ever discovered masturbation.
So, yeah, I guess I would say if there is that Oedipal component, then Lady Jessica becomes one of the first viable substitutes for the mother, for that libidinal energy to find in the fantasy space provided by Lynch.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that's the first substitute viable for a quote unquote healthy, and that's not what I mean, for a unmediated, unrepressed, if you will, investment. I mean, Freud's thing is like in the Oedipal conflict, obviously the father is prohibiting our access to the mother as love object. And so we make these displacements, we make these substitutes, and we alight upon the first acceptable one, right? Because in the incest kind of methodology that he's thinking through, which we've talked about ad nauseum, but, if the mother's not, then the sister, if the sister's not, then the aunt, and you just kind of like go down the line of your like, whoever is closest.
Babysitter, nurse, blah, blah, blah.
Babysitter, nurse. Yeah, obviously Ratman, Wolfman. We saw that the nanny, the nurse is in those positions often. And yeah, so Lady Jessica, I can imagine that in the fantasy space that already is immersing you in, you are disinhibited from the constraints of the reality principle, wherever the fuck, however you want to take that, you are no longer burdened by having to really fornicate with a human person in front of you, but you can embody this fantasy space. And that's why in your screen memory that felt so intense, you don't need to have a passionate sexual encounter with Rebecca Ferguson, Lady Jessica, the new Lady Jessica, the screen for the old one.
Which is also a wild doubling, right? Like,
right. It is. You don't need to have that sexual encounter in the dream. You've already sort of had that sexual encounter all along as a memory trace.
Right, yeah.
It just, in its reactivation, it's screened out, though. Now, of course, you can go deeper and try to, uncover whatever the fuck else. But at the most basic, barely latent level that we talked about, I think that's kind of the associative train of thought that I would embark on. Now, telling the story after the fact is interesting, and saying it as the humble brag, that might be a screen itself for some other instance in your college days that you've said you weren't such a good boy necessarily, that you may have some material that maybe you've kissed and told before and felt some kind of shame or guilt for. I don't know. That would be something that to work out with. You'd have to pay me money. For a session, for one of those Lacanian short sessions. No, but that would be, I guess that would be the more enigmatic aspect, right? Have you reflected on that at all about this?
No, but that actually does bring up a relevant reference to the text. And what did you make of the footnote to Freud's essay on jokes and displacement? Because this could be a way to tie the shit all together into a nice.
Now, this is good because the joke that he retells, because he'll write the joke book 2 years later, right? 3 years later, 1901, 1902. Am I wrong about that? 1905? Okay. Samsonite. I was way off. The joke, quote unquote, is that the screen memory, insofar as it's displaced, is like a scam or a sham, I think is the translation.
Yeah, that's what he says, yeah.
It's like a sham or a scam, I think both works, where the sham or the scam, again, the sham is not made of gold, but is laying beside something that's made of gold, right? There's no actual gold in the sham, but it's dressed up as though it were what you're deceiving someone about. You're luring them in because of the prospect of making money or something. It's alongside, it looks like it, but you're actually not leading them to X marks the spot. And I think that's what he means by screen memory, right? Is like you are adjacent, contiguous in time, in associative, ideational content, right? As I said, those links are that's what's repressed and cut out, and that's part of reconstructing those is how one works through the symptom. But I think that for Freud is this analogy, the simile of it's not gold itself, but it's lying next to the gold. The gold would be the kernel of the symptom or one of the knots to link up with. But the screen memory itself isn't symptomatic. Not in its content, but it's screening something symptomatic. So it's a part of the symptom formation insofar as it's doing some kind of work, which I think why Mayon's terminology fits, but it's not itself symptomatic. It's more of an index, right? I said it's the smoke that indexes the fire, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's good.
One last part, since we're at about 2 hours, although I know more like probably 1:30, 1:45.
Yeah, but
I do want to read the very last paragraph, and we can maybe discuss. Okay, so the sentence preceding the last paragraph, I'll start there. The falsified memory is the first that we become aware of. So the falsified memory, the screen memory. The raw material of memory traces out of which it was forged remains unknown to us in its original form. And even that word there, I'm not sure the German, but using the term forged, and we were just talking about gold. The gold is the sort of the origin, if you will, whatever got screened out, filtered out, Because again, we can think of like a sieve. You're sieving gold, mining for gold in a river. The gold drops out, and what we are left with in the sieve, in the screen memory, is not very interesting, right? But somehow it's intense. Anyway, okay, the last paragraph. The recognition of this fact must diminish the distinction we have drawn between screen memories and other memories derived from our childhood. And he will go on to say something interesting later. I'm not sure if he says it here, but later he will say, it's a question of whether or not all childhood memories, and he means early childhood, are not screen memories. Do not have some of this type of distortion. Okay, so the recognition of this fact must diminish the distinction we have drawn between screen memories and other memories derived from our childhood. It may indeed be questioned whether we have any memories at all from our childhood. This is another way of him saying it. So it may indeed be questioned whether we have any memories at all from our childhood. Memories relating to our childhood may be all that we possess. Because again, the screen memory is actually a relation and not itself a memory in Freud's like terminology. Our childhood memories show us our earliest years, not as they were, but as they appeared at the later periods when the memories were aroused. In these periods of arousal, the childhood memories did not, as people are accustomed to say, emerge. They were formed at that time. They were formed at the time in the later periods, right? They didn't emerge in childhood. This is, again, the Nachträglichkeit, the reminiscence that hysterics suffer from. All right, last sentence. And a number of motives with no concern for historical accuracy had a part in forming them, as well as in the selection of the memories themselves. So that's the kind of further unpacking that Freud would want to do out of this, the further theoretical problem, now that he's kind of dealt with infantile amnesia, at least in general, without yet getting to the 3 essays on sexuality and infantile amnesia in its kind of more sexual aspect and primal repression. But the last part he's left with, what I think hints at it, is what are the motives that chooses or selects or lights upon these screen memories? And I think he means, again, motives in like, not in any sort of conscious way. Sometimes Freud's terminology can be a little misleading. Like, for example, he has a concept called choice of neurosis. And he doesn't mean by the person, like I'm going shopping today for some paranoia. No, I mean, he's talking about why is it that this person becomes hysteric, this person becomes obsessive compulsive, this person develops paranoia, schizophrenia. So the choice really is behind the scenes. It's not about an agent. And so really choice is even there. It's a little misleading. So here too, motives, I think the motives isn't in the person, in the what we call the person, in the sort of conscious, because it's not like I'm choosing to have the screen memory. No, in a certain sense, the screen memory chooses us, right? And we have to like figure out what are the motives behind that type of work that's going on in the screen memory, just as in the dreams. What is the dream work doing? And for Freud, of course, with the dream work, it's some type of wish fulfillment. If that's not itself the motive, it provides the motive force. It provides the dynamism. So what are the motives? And two, if we look at the screen memory that he gives us with the flowers and I guess that we didn't even unpack the deflowering, we just alluded to it, but the deflowering, I suppose I didn't do a good job saying it, would have been, okay, in the screen memory, he and his brother, and again, it's interesting as he has an accomplice, take the flowers from the little girl who supposedly has better flowers than them, whatever that means. And then when he's 16, 17, and he's staying with that family, and he has that intense desire to, you could say at that moment, deflower that girl, but doesn't act on it for whatever reasons. Again, I think it's more about the shame of he should have known this girl since he grew up. He should have never, his parents should have had their shit in order and not made it so that they had to move to Vienna, whatever. So again, I guess that's part of the motive force would be in that desire that we see. But the way Freud builds that screen memory is so interesting because it has certain stages along the way. It's not just I had this memory in the past and then I remembered it in the present, and it's actually like 3 or 4 stages. And so when he says a parallelogram of forces, the terminology he should use is a polygon of forces, because a parallelogram would be the simplest application of 2 forces on a square, for example. But if you've got multiple forces and it's not just 2, you're really thinking of a polygon. And we can imagine a deformation of a square in the same way. And I think that the way he thinks memory works and the way he thinks that memories are activated and reactivated, it's not just the Nachträglichkeit itself, I think has to be think of as multiple. It would be very rare and probably incomplete if we simplified to a 1-to-1 or a 2-fold correspondence, right? A binary relation. It's just that obviously thinking in binary is the simplest we can do. But even Freud doesn't make it that simple for us in the case he gives us. He gives us age 2 or 3, age 17, age 20, age 38, supposedly. He was 43 at the time, really. But, what's a few years between friends? Between myself and my reading public. But yeah, I guess that's the thing. What are the motive forces? And so I think when we analyze your dream, which I'm glad that you provided, to use the term, that material for us, right? We, I think, brought out, again, crudely, some of the motive forces. But we also left some to be unpacked. Again, and I guess the question would be, you remember the humble brag, but was that as clear and intense in that second dream where you recalled the first dream in the dream? Was that setting intense? Was there anything that you remember otherwise than supposedly telling some other person, probably some other guy?
I only remember telling the story in this kind of way of like, oh, well, I have blah, 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 I've showered with this I forget what they mentioned something. I was like, oh, well, I have done it. I don't remember anything from that second dream beyond telling them, and the way that it felt within that moment as if I was recalling a memory from my real life, from my non-dream
So the
self.
intense part was remembering that a dream within the dream space was something that really happened as an event.
Okay. Exactly. Yes.
That's kind of meta. Kind of meta, bro.
Yeah. I mean, that's why it's so
Inception.
That's why I had to, even if we weren't going to talk about it at all, I just had to tell you because it was such a wild fucking experience. I mean, I've had some handful of waking up from a dream like 3 levels down before, but like nothing was quite
nothing that clear and
nothing
lucid.
Where I was like remembering seemingly recalling an actual event from my life that was totally fabricated as part of a overall dream. That was the mind fucking aspect of it. It even felt like, maybe to even make it more intense, was like they were 2 separate dreams. I'm like, that is not clear to me, but I would even say that like these could have been even 2 entirely separate dream experiences within the same night, and recalling a memory from a prior dream that evening as an actual memory from my real life. I mean,
I guess, did you have this dream after or before reading Screen Memories?
Oh, this was before. This was like Wednesday or Thursday night.
Okay.
Yeah. So I hadn't even read this. I read this all
right. Yeah. You
Saturday,
read the Friday, Saturday.
Yeah.
That's a nice serendipitous.
Right.
I guess the last thing I would say is that I mentioned to you in text, and I know we don't need to spend too much time on it, so I'll leave it for reflection on. If listeners are aware of Blade Runner 2049, you can call it the sequel to the original Blade Runner. I guess there's nothing in between it, right? So
no.
Besides the 20 or so director's cuts. And you could find this in Blade Runner, but for me, it sticks out very much more prominently in Blade Runner 2049 in the childhood memory of being chased and then putting the figurine hiding it away and then looking for it later in the movie. Ryan Gosling's character, I forget his name.
K.
Just
K.
A?
K as in
K.
Ku Klux Klan.
Which adds a Kafka-esque element to it, of course. You can see something similar going on where whether or not it qualifies perfectly as a screen memory obviously is called into question because of those memories being fabricated, but the way in which the intensely lived experience that he's fully confident that it was real, I think that aspect at least has some resonances. And then trying to uncover the reality behind the screen memory is part of the like movement of the plot, if you will, if that makes sense, right?
What I think is interesting is the way that there's a kind of metatextual aspect of his memory being almost this like hero's journey type thing. Like, I'm the Messiah, like I'm the hero, which gets subverted obviously in the end of 2049 in an interesting way. That's the analogous aspect back to Dune, right? Because Paul is the kind of like, it's following the same pattern of this messianic figure. This hero's journey, which is captured by both and subverted in different ways, right?
You could even, if you extend it maybe too broadly, so I don't want to go too hard with this, but if you extend screen memory to the generational memory of the Bene Gesserit prophecies that have been internalized by the Fremens, even though there is some suspicions and awareness of this is what Bene Gesserits do for them, it's become a part of the fabric of their culture and their intergenerational memory. There is a kind of weird, but again, that could just be a play of temporality. But behind, we are allowed as readers and viewers to see behind the screen to the supposed origins of the Bene Gesserits. This is partly why the analogy kind of breaks down a little bit, but from the point of view of the Fremens, who see Muad'Dib as Usul, kind of as the one prophesied. Yeah, so you need a kind of, again, this is the other thing that I try to bring out in the analysis is that when you look at screen memories, often the memory is in its distortion. Part of its distortion is it's not a first person memory. It is this kind of view from outside. There are certain, in moments of extreme stress and intensity, there are certain ways of that occurring in real time for persons. But I don't necessarily think that that's at play in screen memories, at least not as a general principle. I think there is something going on in the conversion efforts of the memory that depicts it panoramically rather than, you get what I'm saying? That's why I picked out, I had just noticed it, and maybe I fixated on too much because he's retelling the story, but he's saying there's 3 boys or there's 3 children. And that already kind of like, it's not like I was in my body, me, and I saw the other 2 kids, right? It's even in that way of describing it is kind of interesting and gives us, now again, Freud doesn't go into that, but I think that that's a part of the effect of how the memory trace is reactivated. It's already disembodied and made into a kind of omniscient narrator type description.
Yeah, because I think that definitely works from a meta level with Blade Runner 2049 and the kind of like,
well, the way the scene is described is shown, obviously. It's from a third-person perspective. The way the replaying scene in his mind, we see him as a boy running. Not. We don't have a first-person POV, which they could have done.
Yeah.
Which would have maybe been an interesting way of doing it. And again, this is kind of a flimsy thing to bring up, but I
it's
think
kind of interesting.
I do feel like, as a general rule, you might see this in screen memories in this kind of third person perspective, even though it was lived, obviously, in an embodied way. I think that the way that those memories are brought to consciousness and in its transformation, part of that is a kind of a third personification. Something to chew on for later. I guess we left a lot of meat on the bone, but grist for the mill,
Since we're at the end and we're getting close to close, I'll just mention this because I put this in the notes. I think I might have mentioned to you what I found was kind of an interesting connection to Dune was like the way that the Gola's memories. So a Gola is like a clone, but it's from the dead flesh of someone, and they can't remember their past lives as the actual flesh, but the memories remain latent in the flesh, even in the recreated person. And so the method by which they begin to realize one can awaken these memories is by the experience of a traumatic event, which also parallels the awakening of the ancestral memories for not only Paul, but the Bene Gesserit Reverend Mothers, the catalyst for the Reverend Mothers process of traumatic experience, awakening the memories of the past, the genetic
The water
memory.
of life.
The water of life acts as the trauma that makes those latent memories manifest. So there's a similar process at work, but I just find it quite interesting that there's a traumatic kernel.
You got a little bit of the
moment.
virtual actualization shit going on, right? If the memory is virtual in the genetics, in the water of life allows for that actualization. Well, that's enough Dune and Deleuze for today, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So next week we've got Dwayne Roussel and his new book on
The social link.
Yeah, the social link,
And sociology.
Stuff like that.
Should be fun. I'm looking forward to that discussion.
And then the week after, we've got William Clare Roberts, and I rescheduled Jacob for the week after that, which obviously, pending on your plans.
We can talk about that afterwards. Let me go ahead and close out the episode. And thank everyone for joining us for another edition of the Machine Gun Contest Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor
The
Atkins.
very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.